Hi there, esteemed audience, and welcome to another episode of Middle Grade Ninja. I'm Rob Kent, as you know, the author of Banneker Bones and the Giant Robot Bees, the greatest novel ever written. And it is available for you to download as an ebook for free whenever you're watching or listening to this, wherever fine ebooks are sold. It's also available as a paperback, obviously, and the audiobook is narrated by the exquisite David Radke. Banneker Bones is an 11-year-old biracial boy detective. His father is white, his mother is African American, his sister is Chinese. They are an American family. And this is my contribution to diverse books, is an interracial family in which the subject of there being an interracial family never comes up. They simply are who they are, and their main concern is fighting these giant robot bees. You want to get a copy of this right now as soon as you can, because here in May, the sequel, Banneker Bones and the Alligator People, is coming out. I'm starting to feel those pre-release jitters that I always get when I've got a new book coming out. I've been hearing back from my early beta readers who are very excited about it. I'm excited about it. As you know, Banneker Bones and the Giant Robot Bees is my favorite book. I think it still is. But the sequel, in my opinion, whatever the author's opinion does for you, is as good as Banneker Bones and the Giant Robot Bees. It takes a good thing and expands the universe and makes it bigger. So be on the lookout for that. Under the super secret pen name Robert Kent, I've written some horror stories, including the young adult novel All Together Now, a zombie story, and its companion piece, All Right Now, a short zombie story. Both are available now as ebooks, paperbacks, and audiobooks. The audiobook for All Together Now is also narrated by the exquisite David Radke. You're definitely going to want to check those out, although be warned, just because I'm the middle grade ninja guy, I am capable of writing tremendous violence and things that you would expect when you come to a zombie story. You know, I just binge watched Black Sunday on Netflix over the weekend. There are nonstop zombie stories available. If you're like me, you can't get enough of them. This is a zombie story by a zombie fan, so look forward to that. I've also got the 5-volume horror series, The Book of David. This one is strictly for adults. Lots of profanity, lots of offensive ideas, but the first chapter, if you're curious, chapter 1 of the Book of David in the 5-volume series is available to download for free as an ebook whenever you're watching or listening to this, wherever ebooks are sold. And this is a book that intentionally graduates in intensity and in craziness. And the reason why is I'm hoping to scare off timid readers with chapter 1. So if you make it to chapter 2, I get a little bit meaner. Chapter 3, a lot meaner. And then by the time we get to chapter 5, it's just craziness. So pick up a copy of chapter 1 if you're the sort of person that wants to read about an atheist who buys a haunted house that then begins to give him religious visions about flying saucers. The Book of David's your book. Coming up here on the Middle Grade Ninja podcast, on Thursday, we are going to be fortunate enough to be chatting with literary agent Holly Root. That's going to be an excellent episode. You're not going to want to miss that. And then on Monday, we'll be talking with editor Allison Weiss. Later in the month, we're going to be talking with literary agent Elena Roth Parker. Just heard back from literary agent John Rudolph, who will be making an appearance in May, along with author Jessica Lawson, author Daniel Jose Older, and author Maurice Broaddus, plus some more surprise guests yet to be announced. So look forward to that. Speaking of Maurice Broaddus, this episode is sponsored in part by MoCon. MoCon is the premier writer conference here in Indianapolis. Although it's got some competition now from RosieCon, but MoCon is something I look forward to. I've been looking forward to it all year. I will be there. Many editors, agents, authors will be there. You can go to mauricebroaddus.com to get signed up now. It is running from May 3rd through May 5th. It's $75 if you register early, and that includes food for 3 days. The food is included. You show up, everybody is going to be having a good time. You're going to have a chance to have one-on-one discussions with me and with other publishing professionals. It's well worth your time. Come out, support MoCon. So we can do it again next year. Also, special thanks to the folks who ran RosieCon this year. It was the first ever RosieCon, and that's where I met today's guest, Padma Venkatraman, who I'm so excited to talk to. Padma, how are you today?
I'm very well, thank you.
Well, Padma, I'm terrible about summarizing other people's books and other people's biographies. So, if you would, to start us off, just tell the esteemed audience a little bit about yourself and your background.
So I am the author of 3 novels, actually 4, 4 now. My latest just came out. It's The Bridge Home, and I'm very excited about it. I'm holding up the audiobook because I actually did the audiobook version myself as well. And that was a first for me and very exciting. So The Bridge Home is my 4th novel, and just very succinctly, it's about 2 children, 2 girls who run away from home because of abuse and find themselves homeless on the streets of an Indian city, where they find 2 boys that are orphans and living on the streets as well. And together with a dog that they adopt, they form a little family. And it's about everything that they go through together, their adventures, if you will, in that terrible situation, and their ability to laugh as well, even though they have such a terrible situation. So The Bridge Home is the novel that's sort of the newest baby and the one I'm most excited about. And my previous novels are Climbing the Stairs, my first novel, which actually was edited by John Rudolph, who is now an agent who's going to be on your show. So there's a connection. And my second novel, Island's End. So my first novel, Climbing the Stairs, takes place in India in the 1940s. It was one of the first historical fiction novels for young adults to be written and published in this country. Not the first, but one of the first. And Island's End is about a tribe that lived close to me when I was on the Andaman Islands of India as an oceanographer. So I ended up coming to writing after doing a PhD, a doctorate in oceanography, and working as an oceanographer for a while. And Island's End is about leadership. It's about culture clashes between indigenous people and the modern world, and about rainforests and coral reefs and all these other things that are now threatened by our modern civilization. And A Time to Dance, which is my third novel, is the first young adult novel that deals with spirituality or spiritual awakening as a main theme, as seen through the Hindu lens. So the lens of a young Hindu girl.
Well, Padma, you've got such an amazing background. I want to talk a lot about The Bridge Home today because I am truly over the moon in love with this book. I try never to say I love one book other than others because I talk to a lot of authors, and that's a way to lose friends. But I love your book more than some others. It's rapidly become one of my absolute favorites. We're going to talk about that. I've been joking with my wife over the weekend and the last week here, knowing I was going to get to talk with you, that how am I possibly going to talk with someone as accomplished as Padma is. And usually if I have a guest on the show, I assume they're probably smarter than I am, and anybody who listens or watches the show would probably agree with that sentiment. But in this case, there's no ambiguity whatsoever. I know you're smarter than me. Well, let's start with the fact that you've lived in 5 different countries. What has living in 5 different countries taught you about the world, and what has it brought to your writing?
I think I could talk about that for just a day in itself. First of all, though, I do want to say there are so many different kinds of intelligence and so many different kinds of smartness, and I'm sure that I'm not smarter than you in all of those ways, certainly not. And I think that's such an important thing, really, to recognize. I mean, sometimes we think of intelligence or smartness in only one way, and there is such a lot. Such a lot of ways that we don't recognize as well. Anyways, living
I will
in...
quickly acknowledge that if you and I were to play Mortal Kombat, I might win.
Exactly, you certainly would. So I grew up in India. So I was born in India, and I grew up and I was there for most of my childhood and most of my teen years. So I was there for about 19 years. And then I ended up going to England on a scholarship and studying at an international school there. And that was, it was called Brockwood Park. It was actually a lot like, Hogwarts. It really was. It had a tower. We would go up there and look at the stars and all of this. Anyway, it was a wonderful year for me, and a year during which I did a lot of writing. And it meant a lot to me, actually, that year, that people who were British, that people who had, or who knew English and no other language, to whom English was a first language, actually thought that I spoke it and I wrote it as if it were my mother tongue as well. So that was something that really was very helpful to me. It felt very supported by that. And after that, I came to the States, and I've lived here for longer than I want to let you know, because then you'll know my exact age. Not that I really care, but maybe
I'm
that's
guessing
something.
around 25. Am I pretty close?
Yeah, just about 5 years ago. Anyways, so I came here, and I went to graduate school at the College of William and Mary, and I studied oceanography. And it was quite an unusual decision for, I think, a woman of color. But also in India, we have, there were lots of social stigmas attached to things, and oceanography was not usually on the radar for anyone. But I did it anyway, and I'm very glad that I did. And after I did oceanography, and during the course of many other things, I finished my doctorate. I did my postdoc at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. But in between, I worked in Germany for a while, and I worked in the United Arab Emirates as well for a while. So I've lived actually in those 5 countries beyond other countries that I've visited. And I think the one thing that I've learned is that we say a lot about equality. We mouth these words, but then I think the experience of actually living in those countries is what brought it home to me, in my head and also in my heart. The idea that no matter what religion you subscribe to, no matter what ethnicity you might have, what race you might have, what gender you might have, and where you might be on the disability spectrum, it doesn't matter. There are things that we all share, and there's also things that we will never share. And I think both need to be respected, in that each of us is very, very different as well from everyone else. Does that make sense?
It does, and I've got so many questions for you. I want to go back for just one quick second, because I know you've talked about your upbringing before without dragging the whole thing out. I know that you were in a situation somewhat similar to the children in the Bridge home, and that you were in an abusive household, and then you were raised by a single mother, and you were not necessarily in dire poverty yourself, but certainly surrounded by quite a bit of poverty. How did you get from there to winning a scholarship to ascend to where you're at today on the Middle Grade Ninja Show?
I think a lot of things changed. So when I was born into a family that was extremely wealthy, but my mother was fiercely independent, as was I. So when my father and my mother split up, which was extremely unusual in India, I was the only child with parents who were separated that I knew growing up. And that's not to say it never happens, but I was the only one at my school, for instance, and so on. After he left, we had a huge fall. My mother started with less than zero in the bank, because there was a huge burden of debt as well. So that means that it was very, very, very difficult for several years. So throughout my childhood after that, so 8 on up until through when I left India and went away, and for many other years, it was very, very tough for my mother. It's only recently, I think, that she feels a little more comfortable. And of course, once I left, and I was, ultimately on my own dime, and it was a little difficult being a graduate student, but people would complain all the time about how poor they were as graduate students. And yes, it was difficult. Those were the days that we couldn't do what we're doing now, which is so remarkable to me. Technology was not that advanced. So I would have to call my mother on the phone, and you'd have these operators that said 3 minutes, and then they would cut you off after 3 minutes. And that was the one phone call I had every month to connect with my mother, who was overseas. And where I lived in Southern Virginia, there was no one else that I knew who were, no friends or family nearby, except for the friends that I made at the school. And so that's something that I think many authors, even who are second generation or who have come here with their parents at a young age to this country, don't completely understand what that feels like and how very independent you need to be able to do something like that. And I don't even think I thought twice about it until now. And recently, somebody was talking about something, and I imagined my own child at 19 leaving and going halfway across the world. That's when I realized what I did. And I think it can be quite scary. And certainly for me, it was different. It was interesting. I learned a lot. I learned certainly to be independent, to be on my own 2 feet. And well, now I think I'm fine financially, luckily. I'm not necessarily rolling in wealth, but I certainly have a degree that I can fall back on. And I think the thing that I learned the most from my mother was this. She had a lot of education. And that was why when my father left home and left her in this financial mess, and me as well, he did not pay toward my upkeep or any of that. And when that happened, I think the reason that she was able to take off is not quite the word perhaps, but to make ends meet really was because she had, an education, and she always talked about that, the importance of that education that nobody could take away from her, and how she could fall back on that and use that to start from scratch, or less than scratch, I should say.
Well, you're obviously fierce determination, fiercely independent. But anytime I talk to someone extraordinary, and I consider you to be extraordinary, one question I want to ask you, the hopes of becoming extraordinary, or maybe at the very least inspiring someone else who might be listening or watching to become extraordinary, are what are the qualities that you fell back on? What is it that motivated you? Because I'm sure that there are other people that are in similar circumstances. Certainly, I know lots of people in much softer circumstances who have not gone on to do all the things that you've done. So what kept you motivated? What continues to motivate you?
First of all, I mean, I must say I'm not extraordinary at all, by a long shot. But I think what kept me motivated, what kept me going, there were several things that I think were important to me growing up. One of them was that I felt, I had seen what my mother had gone through, and that made me firmly convinced that I needed to be able to call the shots when I wanted to. In my own life, I wanted to be the person dictating the terms. So that was very important to me. She certainly was a strong female in a culture that did not necessarily always value strong females. And so I think she taught me that it was fine to be alone, and that was not something that very early on, I knew the difference between loneliness and being alone. And I think being alone is a choice that you make. And sometimes, for instance, if you're the only female of color on an entire ship, which is dominated by or is filled with just white men, and you are the chief scientist, which was the situation for me sometimes, then you have made the choice to be alone. And I think that gave me a certain courage. I'd never felt lonely on a vessel, but I knew that I was alone, and that's a bit different. I think there's sort of a dignity that comes with that choice, maybe, of being able to do that on your own. So that's something that I took away. And I think I learned very early in my life not to depend on other human beings, which is to say, not even emotionally. And that doesn't mean I don't like people. I actually like people a lot. And I think, by virtue of what I'm doing now, being an author, especially writing for young people, you don't make a whole lot of money. But I do that because I care, and because I think my words might matter, and I think my words can touch people in a way that nothing else I do can touch people. And to me, writing is an act of compassion. It's a way to sort of increase the compassion and empathy there is in the world. And so I think that's why I write. And I think I learned very early on that those things matter, that compassion matters, that empathy matters, that human beings matter a lot, and you can reach out to them that way, but also that you should never allow another human being to take over your life or your emotions, maybe, or your life. And it was very, my siblings would constantly, who were much older than me, who were out of the house and adults before anything happened to me, before my parents split up, would constantly say all the time, and they still do, 5 minutes into any conversation, if there's anything going wrong, they will cite what happened to me, actually. When, oh, our father split up, oh, our father did this. And I think you don't even know the half of it. And I will never, ever use, I've decided that when I was about 8, I will never use my father or any other person. And there are other violent men in my family, though they may not think they are. I will never use them as an excuse for what I am. I will never use them as an excuse for my behavior. I will never allow anything that happened to me to define who I am in a negative way. And so I think, yes, economic hardship that I did face. Yes, I was always the poor cousin. And, then again, I had other people around me who had more, and maybe that itself provides a kind of security in the family. But I think I learned very early that I wasn't going to let those things that other people could see as negative impact me negatively. And I think that's a choice I made. And as you pointed out, one of the things that did happen was that my mother did a lot of work, a lot of charity work in her time. And that's where I met kids like the kids in the Bridge home. And so I knew what dire poverty was. And when people here say they grew up very poor, I say sometimes poor now because I've lived in this country for so long. But when they talk about dire poverty, or when they say they grew up in poverty, to me, poverty was not having a roof over your head. Poverty was being hungry. And when my daughter comes home and says she's hungry, that's not hunger. I mean, it's beyond imagination, the level of hunger, the level of insecurity that some of the children that I got to know faced. And one of the friends that I had came from a very, very different socioeconomic class. He was a Dalit, which I never thought about. Now, thinking back on it, I realized that he was. And I think just knowing those children and seeing their courage, they were extraordinary. And that made an impact on me. The fact that they could be kind, the fact that they could laugh in spite of all that they had seen, that was extraordinary.
I'm chuckling. I was reading The Bridge Home last week, and my 5-year-old was complaining because I'd given him the food that wasn't the food he wanted to eat, so he was refusing to eat it and complaining. And I started giving him a speech about the kids in the Bridge Home, and my wife comes over and says, "Are you giving him the starving kids in China speech?" And I said, "No, this is the starving kids in India speech. Very different." Well, I want to talk about the novel, but just a couple quick questions about your bio first, just because it is not unheard of and not that unusual, but you have a very scientific mind, obviously. So, how do you balance both the left and right portions of your brain so well that you've been able to excel both as an oceanographer, what also drew you to the sea, versus what's now got you out and about and doing something very left brain minded, which is promoting your novels?
I'm not sure I'm not sure I'm good at both or that I excel at both. I think I might just be a fake in two fields. But anyways,
Well, I can't speak to what sort of oceanographer you are because I haven't seen you out there, but I did read your book and I can absolutely attest that you are an excellent novelist.
Thank you. I think this idea of the two brains and all of that, I see the sort of reductionist idea which tends to come from Europeans and Eurocentrism. I think, to me, growing up in India, in Indian culture, there was never really a huge, I think, division made between the arts and the sciences in the way we do now today in the West. And there was also, I think, even religion and spirituality and science were not necessarily set apart the way that they are, or they were even here historically, with sort of, Galileo being told that what he did was heresy. that didn't happen to other astronomers who made very similar discoveries in India independently of him. So I think that for me, I didn't see the two as different. And also, I've said this before, and mathematics is music, and language at its best is music. And language sings in a way and there are patterns of words on a page that are not that different to me, in a sense, than patterns of numbers. So to me, they're integrated. To me, they are sort of facets of the same thing. There's rhythm, if you will. There's rhythm and rhythm, music, pattern, all of that exists in language, and all of that exists in music, and all of that exists in mathematics and numbers too.
That makes a lot of sense. Now that I hear you say that, because there are passages. I checked my highlights. I've got 90 some odd highlights from the book, and they're very musical. Obviously, I didn't sing them, but they read in such a way to move the reader that I wonder how is she so good at science and also so good at this, because it is a little bit rare that you get both. I've read a lot of science fiction authors where they've nailed the science and they haven't quite got the prose or the story down, but there's enough of an idea there that I'm still having a good time. Whereas in your case, there's at least in The Bridge Home, not so much science, but the storytelling is very much there and is very moving. In fact, let's just go straight to The Bridge Home. You've sold an audiobook, at least one today, because I read the ebook, and now that I know that you read the audiobook, I'm going to put it on my Audible collection immediately and download it, because I bet that's an amazing performance. In fact, let's just start there. What was the experience of recording your own book as an audiobook?
It was wonderful. Oh, I should say, actually, the book just won an Audiophile Magazine Earphone Award, which I didn't even know existed, and I didn't even know they give awards that quickly, because it just came out in February, so it's not that old.
Well, congratulations! That's awesome.
I was very excited because it's my first audiobook, and I wanted to do the best thing for the book. So you know how that is. If you have a book, it's like a baby, and you really want the best for it. So I did want to read my own book, and I wondered if I should, because I do like to read aloud. But I auditioned for the book, and my audition went to the director who does audiobooks, and then she and I had a conversation, and then she brought up the names of some readers that I thought were wonderful. So I was on the fence as well, because I didn't know that I would be able to do a better job. And so then I spoke to her and I said, I'm not really certain. And she said, I think you should give it a shot, because I think the author brings something to it that no other reader can. And so even though you're inexperienced, I'll let you do it, which is fine. And I did, and it was grueling. It's not easy, because it's nothing like reading to, I don't know, to your son at night or something, because then you're reading a very short passage. This is reading for days on end. And if you're not a professional actor or actress, I think it's quite hard. But I'm so glad I did it. And I love this book. And I would never pick favorites with any of my books, but at some level, this book has so much of myself in it, I think. All the others as well have some parts of me in them, but this feels so personal, so close to me in so many ways. Every character is based on a real person. So much of the book is based on true incidents and there's so much of the emotion draws from what happened to me and my life. And I drew on all of that. So I think it meant a lot to me to be able to read it, and I'm just very glad I did. It's different, but I'm glad that I did that. It's challenging as well.
Oh, I know exactly what you mean in terms of picking a favorite among your books, because I love them all. I don't publish something that I don't love and think that won't be a good read for a esteemed reader. But Banneker's my favorite. It just is. So I think I understand a little bit there. Can you go back and can you listen to the audiobook and listen to yourself read your story?
I can. With the other books, I have a hard time, because I'm a person who constantly edits. So I always wonder if I should have changed this word or something, that sort of thing. And it's not to say that that would make it any better, by the way. I think my editor, Nancy Paulson, is absolutely brilliant. I couldn't have a better editor. And I would never second guess her. I think she's amazing. I trust everything that she does to make my book better, to make our book better, I should say. But having said that, I think that when you read a book, when you edit a book, it's something that a part of you just always, I call it the editor Padma and the author Padma, and I feel like the editor Padma just comes over my shoulder sometimes and says, maybe you should have done that, or maybe you should have done this. But with this book, no. I think I don't know, maybe I'm still just infatuated with it. I hope I always will be. I've never regretted anything, not a word that I felt that I would have used differently or anything. And maybe it's partly because I read the whole book out and, I embodied it when I read it. That might be part of it too, but I love it.
So it gave you sort of a release once you had read it and heard it and said, yes, no, I said the thing that I came to say. That is the book I intended. And now I can move on to my next project.
Yes. Yes. I am very busy, so I'm not sure that I have moved on to a large project, but I have several things in the works, so we'll see what happens.
Let me ask you about the book, because I know it is based in part on your experience and on folks you knew. So 2 questions about that. 1, what additional research did you still need to do to complete this book? And 2, how do you balance the need to respect what happened and who the people that you're basing this on were versus your need as a storyteller to take the story in new places and serve your thematic concerns?
Those are great questions, and I'm a little scared that they're each so important that I'm scared that I'm going to forget them. So first of all, one of the things I think is so important is research. So even if you think you know a story, I think you need to do research, because let's say a certain person, an author, has 2 siblings, and let's say they all grew up at the same time with the same parents in the same house. And there may have been incidents that they all experienced together, and yet each of them has a unique take on that incident, and they probably will remember it with slight differences. And it goes back to something we were talking about earlier, that each of us is different. And so there might be so much that's similar, but there is always that difference. And so I think even if you were writing your own memoir, you're not the same person you used to be. So you need to do some level of research to go back and to understand maybe that other time or the other place in your own mind, to connect with it emotionally, but also just physically to do research to see what was going on at that time. Perhaps what you remembered may not have been quite so accurate. Check what was actually available, what was there in terms of setting and so on. And I have seen sometimes, for instance, South Asian writers write about South Asia and get it wrong because they don't know enough. So I was back in India. I go back every year pretty much. I try to do that. And so I certainly did research when I was there. I spoke to people who had worked with children. I spoke to children. I went to places. I don't want to say too much to give away anything, but I went to places like the places that the kids are in the Bridge Home. And I think all of that informed me. One of the other things that I really looked at, and that was very, very important, were notebooks that I had written when I was a child. So when I was a child, I loved books and I loved writing, and I always thought I would be an author and I would write. So I wrote notes. Some of the children that my mother worked with, that I spoke about, would come to our house because I think they felt it was safe. And sometimes they would come and talk to her. They were staying at a residential school, many of them, but they would come over and they would speak to her and to me, and stay overnight at our place, and they would tell stories of what they had been through. And one of those young people had actually lived in a graveyard. And when I think about that, she'd run because she was running away from men who wanted to enslave her. And when I think about what she did, that's astonishing to me. I mean, the level of bravery that you would have to be able to do something like that, and also the depravity of the adults who would force a child into any such situation. It's just so shoddy, so shocking. Anyways, so there was that made a tremendous impact on me. And she said she would call me her akka, my older sister, and she said, will you write my story one day? And I said, I will. And so in some ways, this is a promise that needed to be kept. And there's there's so much else. The other people in the book are based on people that I knew as well. So on the one hand, I think there's a great deal of respect you need to give somebody like that says, would you write about me? That, on the other hand, if it's not nonfiction, if it's fiction, there is the responsibility you have to the story as well. And I think of it more as the responsibility I have to the characters who are in my head to tell that story well. And at some stage, I definitely need to think about the reader as well. I don't think about the reader when I write. I think about the reader when I edit. So that's important to me too, because I think you have to be able to spill out, and you have to be able to, whatever comes into your mouth, to channel every word that comes in and get it out there on the page. But then you can chop it and redo it as you need to chop and redo. I often speak about puking or vomiting words on the page and then cleaning up with bleach. And I think
that's a pretty good metaphor.
Yeah, and that's how I think about it. And so at that stage, when it comes time to do the bleach clean, to do the edit, you do think about other things. But I think it's important to be as true to the story as you possibly can. And there were certain things I wondered about, whether I should change or whether I should not change, and I just felt I couldn't. And I can't explain to you why, but deep inside me, I felt it would be wrong to change certain aspects of the story as it was told to me.
Do you encounter that with your previous books, where even if it's not based on a person that you've actually known, but the character wants to behave a certain way? Do you still feel that call of responsibility of, even if this might work better, this is the story the character wants?
Not quite as much with the others, no. I don't. Well, with Island's End to a large degree, because I think there was a tussle at one point. I wondered whether, well, I think I did and my editor did as well, whether there needed to be two voices. And then I think one voice took over the story, and I realized that it was her story and not anybody else's place to even be there. It was no one else's place as much. And I think if you write multiple points of view, you definitely need it to be equally two other people's stories, or three, or however many viewpoint characters you have. Each of them needs to be central to what they're saying as well. So they need to be really important in that story. So that's something that is important. The other thing that I think is perhaps necessary is that when you write and there is this feeling that the character is taking off and telling you the story, and the character is going on, the character is not going to take over your story. That, at the end of the day, at some point, you're the one who edits, you're the one who decides. So I think it's a fine balance between allowing this character to take over your mind and your heart and your soul, and being able to tell it in a way that feels true and that is true. But there's also, you can't use that as an excuse for meandering into all these other places and losing your way, because at the end of the day, you are steering that craft of your story. You are at the helm of that ship. You are the captain of your ship. You have to get it through, and you can't sort of be bogged down in this storm-tossed ocean in the middle of your book, and nobody knows where you're going, and you don't either. That doesn't work for me. So I think it's a fine balance, and you need to do both. You do need to look and say, yes, I have a responsibility to tell the story as I see it, but I also have a responsibility to tell the story to my readers and to make it readable and to make it polish it.
That makes sense. And that's typically the way it works on this end as well. Although I always tell the famous anecdote that originally the alligator people were supposed to be the villains in the first Banneker Bones book. And at about, I don't know, 20, 25 pages in, Banneker comes onto the scene and decided to be a jerk. I hadn't planned for him to be a jerk. He just was. And I said, oh, that is the character. And he took the story in a completely different direction. I've never been sorry that that happened because it made a much better book than the book I had planned. And so I always try to allow at least a little bit for the characters to take over and have their say, so that if this makes any sense without me sounding like a crazy person, it's as much their book as it is mine.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But then again, I think at the end of the day, I do think there is a time that you come in and you take the reins. And yeah.
Oh, sure. No, draft 2, I was cutting out all sorts of meandering sequences.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about the narration in the bridge home, because something that fascinates me is this is a first-person account from Fiji, the main character, but she is talking to us, the reader, and we, the reader, are the character of Ruku, her younger sister, or no, sorry, her older sister. Why was that perspective important to maintain? How does it serve the novel without spoiling to put the reader inside the head of Ruku?
I think there's several authors. So I'll go back to Climbing the Stairs. My first novel was something that I had a bit of a struggle finding the voice. So I wrote the whole thing out as a diary first, and I felt it was too close. It was just too narrow, the focus. And so I rewrote the whole thing in third person, and then it just felt very distant, and it just wasn't the right voice. And then I rewrote the entire novel in first person, but it wasn't a diary. And that was the right voice. So it took me a few reruns of the entire novel, a few rewrites of the entire 500 pages to find that voice. With Island's End, as I just said, I had multiple points of view. Then I ended up throwing one of those points of view out. So that was, again, a major rewrite. And that book went through 3 complete rewrites too. I often do that. With The Bridge Home, again, I did that, which was kind of silly. But, the voice first came to me as a novel in verse. So it was written in poetry. And that is the correct form for that, as far as I'm concerned, because it marries very well with the dance theme. It's about a dancer who loses her leg and continues to dance again. But through that process of physical recovery also awakens her own spirituality, comes to an understanding of her own spirituality. Now, spirituality, if we want that to exist without dogma, without religion, without sermonizing or proselytizing, that needs to then be in that white space. And to me, that's what verse did for that novel, was allow that white space to be the place that I really met the reader. And so, a novel in verse with the rhythm that is accentuated with poetry, there's also, of course, dance rhythms. And so, that was the perfect medium for that book. And finally, when I started to write The Bridge Home, it was the voice, and I knew it was the voice from the beginning. I knew one of the sisters was talking to the other sister, and frankly, I needed to find out why as well. And yes, there's all this, in retrospect, we say, oh, this novel was based on so-and-so, but I didn't start out feeling I was going to write this novel about somebody. So I always end up with a voice coming into my head and listening to that voice. And then the voice turns into sort of a ghost that is haunting me, and I can see this person and I can hear this person's voice. And then it's like somebody who's actually possessing my soul, and all of me is in that book. My head, my heart, my eyes, my senses, everything. I'm just in that book in a way that's more intense than watching a movie. But I still don't necessarily know in the beginning who that character is or who they're inspired by or any of the rest of it. It's only sort of after I've written out the first draft that I can sit back and say, oh, that was Indra, now I know. And I know now who the other, oh, that was Nagabhushan, that was so-and-so. But I couldn't tell you that when I'm writing the first draft.
Makes sense. Well, I've got more questions about the bridge home, but I want to talk about that just a little bit. Um, Regular listeners and viewers of the show know how much I love to make fun of Ayn Rand, and I never get tired of it. I always give her props for being an incredible woman of her time who bravely stood up and said, "This is what I believe. The world will listen to me," and they did. So Ayn Rand gets that street cred. Beyond that, her ideas were mostly terrible, and I hate that she shaped so much of the financial situation that we're in now. Another discussion. But Ayn Rand said something once that was like, "Oh, even a broken clock is right two times a day," and she said that when you're working on a novel, if you're showing up and you're putting in the time every day and you're thinking about the characters and the stories, sooner or later you're experience where it will feel like magic, that you've got just the right thing that you need to progress the story in some way or progress the character. And that's not magic, that's your subconscious working in all of the time that you're away from your story, because you're showing up every day, even in your off hours, when you're eating, doing fun stuff, reading other people's books. Your brain's still working back there unbeknownst to you, and so it can then come up and suggest that. I counter that with, I've had a few oddball experiences in my life that lead me to believe not that a muse comes to my office and sits behind me as I write, but that something within the universe offers a bit of feedback. I feel almost when I'm writing as though I'm communing with the divine in some way. And I know I'm aware how woo-woo that makes me sound. I don't care. If you're not writing, you don't know. And if you are writing, you probably do. How do you feel about that? Do you feel that there is a muse, that there's something beyond yourself that passes through you into your novel? Or is it simply what Ayn Rand suggested, your subconscious working, and it just feels like magic?
I don't know. To me, I could see both. I am a scientist and I'm a writer as well. I can fully say perhaps it is the subconscious that shows up, but that subconscious, if it is that, feels like magic. It feels like the divine. So to me, it doesn't matter that much whether it really is magic, whether it really is the divine, whether it is the subconscious. What matters is that I love that process, and that process, I think, makes me a better person. And that's part of why I do it. I feel like this is almost a meditation for me when I write. It's an act of compassion for me to write, and I think it's an act of compassion when one reads and identifies and empathizes with another character as well. And that's why I do what I do. I love it in a way that feels to me the most profound, in the sense of deep. One of the most profound experiences that I can have is having that sense that a character has taken me over and understanding that character. So who knows what it is, but I think we definitely do, though. And I'm sure that even Ayn Rand would have to admit this. We do reach for something that is beyond us. We do reach for something that is above us when we write, as in we reach for maybe that which makes us particular, but also that which makes us the same. We reach for the depths of truth. We reach for the heights of compassion, even if we are trying to portray characters who aren't compassionate. Even if you are trying to portray or trying to show a character who isn't kind, in some way when you write, you are kind of communing with that part of maybe yourself or someone else. And that increases, I think, your human understanding, your intelligence, if you will, in that way. Human intelligence.
I think that makes sense. It's one of the things I like about writing horrors. I like to write about the folks that are being chased by the zombies or the monsters, but I also like writing from the perspective of the monster, because that allows me to indulge in things I would never do in real life. And if I just abandon all of my responsibilities and the things that tether me to being hopefully a good person. If I just wanted to be the meanest I possibly could and indulge in the full anger and rage that a lot of us feel at one point or another, and that allows that to kind of run amok, and then it's like, I've exercised that for myself for today. It's the esteemed reader's problem. Now I can go back and focus on the nice middle grade ninja fellow that I usually am. Which is just something I find. I have so many more questions about The Bridge Home, but while we're talking a little bit about spirituality, this is a book that's very much religiously themed. Viji is our narrator, is exceedingly practical, exceedingly determined and disciplined. She what's the word I'm looking for? She reminds me of you, which I'm sure is not a coincidence, and that she is very practically minded, very focused, and she is, or at least she presents as an atheist early in the story. She gives us her thought about the gods that people are worshiping, and then they ultimately thought about Jesus and the switch there to Western religion. And before we talk about, well, she's that way, but then there's also another character in the story, Arul. But I'm so sorry, am I pronouncing the name right?
Arul, yeah.
Arul, there we go. And Arul has had an experience, without spoiling, he lost his family in a very tragic way. And so something that broke my heart is that he has held on to these beliefs that he's gained from a missionary, that he's yearning in some ways for death, because as soon as he dies, he gets to go up to heaven and be back with his family. So his approach to life seems, if I'm interpreting correctly, and I'm probably not, but it seems to be a little bit of, okay, well, if we continue to survive, great. If we die, even better, because then I'll be in heaven sooner. And so much of the novel is centered around some of the conversations back and forth between these two and some other events that come and kind of shape an argument in one way or another about religion. So I just wanted to ask you, just in general terms, when you're talking about religion for the middle grade market, for young impressionable readers of diverse backgrounds that are going to come to this, what responsibilities do you have when discussing religion? What is the best way to talk about religion and spirituality with younger readers?
I think one thing that it's funny to hear you say that it's religious. I didn't think about the religion at all, actually, when I was writing the novel. In fact, when I finished it, I thought it was the one novel that didn't have that very much, which is odd, I know, because with the others, I think I felt that it was there. And I realized later that, of course, it was that. It's something that I think is part of my life. It's part of my experience. It's something that I think about. And so it plays a part in my novels. And also, I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid of, well, I'm afraid of some things. But there's a lot that I'm not that afraid of. I've had several experiences that have taught me to test the limits of my fear as well. And I think one of the things I certainly am not afraid of is discussing religion openly. And I am very open, I think, about religion as well. And I wanted to, I see in retrospect, this is me speaking, I think that after having written A Time to Dance, which is about a young girl seeing spirituality through the lens of Hinduism, and I do think of every religion as just that, as a lens that you see the world through, and no more than that. And I think the truth, whatever it is that the characters in The Bridge Home argue about, doesn't change. And yes, you have Viji, who is just vehemently opposed to the idea of God or a higher power or a higher being of any sort in any religion. And you have Arul, who is firmly convinced of the Christian view that he has been given, the Christian view that he has grown up with. And each of them remains strong. And I think that's very important, that they don't convert each other, that they don't ever try to, a little bit maybe, but they don't actually ever succeed in pulling that person one way or the other. What they do come to is an understanding of one another's views and a respect of one another's views. And that love that they have for each other holds despite that difference. And I think that's one of the most powerful aspects of when you write about religion. If you were going to come down forcefully and try to shove a religion down any person's throat, especially a middle grade reader, I think you need to be very, very careful, because I think a church or a synagogue or a temple or a mosque may be a place for an adult to expound on their religious views. I don't think a book is a place for an adult to do that. I don't think an author, especially an author for young people, has a responsibility, I do think, to refrain from sermonizing. We are not people who give sermons. We should not be people who give sermons. I don't believe that authors should try to educate or to, God forbid, if here I am saying God forbid, convert someone or try to actively change their religious views. I don't think that's our place. I don't think we should. And so I think if you are going to look at religion or handle religion in any way in your novel, it has to be done with a lot of sensitivity, a lot of understanding, and a deeply sincere respect of the equality of the uh, of the absolute right for someone else to have a different point of view. And I think if it doesn't come from that place of really sincere acceptance, that's not a great idea to put then religion in your novel. If you aren't completely accepting of other people's worldviews, then you need to be very careful what you say and don't say, because the last thing you want is for your novel to become a sermon. The last thing you want is for your novel to be some sort of proselytization tool. And to me, the way that I saw Arul, the way that I saw Muthu and Viji and Ruku, there were children who went through those sorts of horrible things that I had met. And some of them many of them came out with these very diametrically opposed views. Some felt firmly, deeply, even more so than before, that their religion was something that gave them strength and solace. And some said, no. And, so you see that. And I think it's quite common that if you go through a very difficult experience, you end up on one of those extreme ends of the spectrum.
That makes sense. I was particularly struck by a passage. I'd have to pull it up here. But at one point, they come across some worms that have come up after a rain. And then the worms are struggling and kind of pathetic, and there's no food available for them. They're trying to get back to where they can find some food. I think it's our rule that has the revelation that maybe we're God's worms, or maybe it's not.
Muthu says that. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Muku said that, and Muku says that makes sense. That we're God's worms. God he must be so big and have other concerns that he can't worry about us, the little worms, which really stuck with me. I don't know if there's a question in there. I just wanted to tell you I like your book.
Yeah, the interesting thing that some people have asked me why it was Christianity that Arul was, why is Arul a member of the Christian faith? And I think that people see it as Western, and it's not. And I mean, I'm the last person that would cater to an audience like that. I think it's very important for me in my own self to understand different religions. It always has been. And I think Christianity is part of the Indian experience. It's part of the South Asian experience. Actually, the earliest Christians were, or some of the earliest Christians anyway, maybe not all of them, were in India. So India has had Christianity and Christians from way back when. We actually believe that one of the apostles came to India. And so the first Indian Christians were happy practicing their religion when in Europe there were no Christians, or the few Christians that there were being persecuted. And so I think that's something that people don't understand. And some of the Indian Christians are extremely proud of that heritage. They're not converts, and they're not, recent converts. They've had that religion for for centuries. And so there is that religious tradition in India. So that's something that's important. There's certainly other ways to think about other facets. There was this person, Sister Catherine, who worked with fisher folk when I was in India, somebody else that my mother had actually worked with for a while in our lives. And she, there are scenes near the beach where they see these shacks and so on. And Sister Catherine was there helping the children who went fishing every day. And I think, that had an impact on me as well. And it's certainly a tradition that I'm exposed to every day living in this country. When I grew up, my last 2 years of school were in a Catholic school. My years of doing my bachelor's degree was at a Catholic institution as well. So there's that, and my husband has a Christian background too. So it's not, it's a religion that certainly I have a lot, not only of familiarity, but also a great deal of knowledge about, and I think a lot of a substantial experience of. Does that make?
It does.
Yeah.
I hear you very clearly. In fact, something I wanted to make sure I ask you, because I feel it's not something I ask every guest, but something that's fair game. I asked Kathy Appelt when we were talking about her book, Angel Thieves, which is also somewhat religiously themed. And I've got a post that will be going live at middlegradeninja.com here the week of Easter. It'll be called Thoughts on God, in which I've had enough emails about my religiously themed books, the Book of David and the zombie stories. I'm not yet comfortable enough discussing religion in middle grade, so neither of the Bannekers features anything religiously oriented. But I have talked about it in horror novels, because I don't know how you do a horror story in Indiana without at some point somebody talking about their religious thoughts. So I'll start. I believe I've gone back and forth. I have a very religious upbringing. I stepped away from that and went full atheist for a minute, but I've had these experiences in my life that I can't, as much as I'd like to, I can't discount, where I very much felt some form of divine intervention, and I have to factor that into my worldview. So I am a begrudging believer in that. I would like to sound as smart as Christopher Hitchens, and I don't, and I'm aware of that. Because of those experiences I've had. And I feel it's fair game, when you've discussed religion openly as you have, to ask, what are your views on spirituality, at least at this point, because I know that's an ever-evolving subject.
I think that there's a very beautiful, actually it's a Hindu prayer that many of us know. I think that sums up my views on religion, really, and spirituality. It says every human being, every soul, and there's a scientist side of me, and there are certainly many scientist friends I have, and they say, some of them say to me, if you have a belief in a soul, then you're not really a scientist, in which case that it is what it is. But I do believe that there is something beyond the physical body that we have that makes us alive. And I love this poem that says each soul is like a river that takes its own path to the one big ocean. And I love that, because I really think of it that way. I think that every human being, no matter what religion you might be in, no matter what religious view you may have, or how you may decide to go toward it or away from it, whatever the meanderings are that that your soul takes, at the end of the day, we all go to that one same place. And to me, that is an ocean of compassion that we all end up in. We may have different names for it, but to me, those are names. Those try to describe that which cannot be described.
So you believe there's something greater, but are perhaps not comfortable at this time defining the absolutes of what that may or may not be? Am I hearing that right?
Yeah. And I do think that with the understanding that everybody has a different idea and a different path, and that people may disagree, I do think that each person has their own evolution, their own way to get to that place, and that all paths are ultimately going to the same place. There's no point. I don't know. I mean, I don't really buy into inequality. I don't like it terribly when people think that they're better off than someone else for any reason, including the religion that they subscribe to. Does that make sense?
That absolutely makes sense. So what do you think happens when we die, or do you have a thought on the subject?
I don't know, but I hope we come back, and I hope that whole theory of like Indian coming back for different lives. I would love for that to be true. I'd come back as a writer every time.
I don't know that I would. I'm having a very good time this time around, but maybe next time I want to try something else. We'll see. let's move on. I've got so many questions for you. Let's talk about some less controversial things about the Bridge Home. Starting with the title. I love that title because the Bridge Home is literally a good title because it's about four children who live and who make a home under or on a bridge. But then it also has these wonderful metaphorical meanings about what the experience is for our main character without spoiling. So I'm always curious when I see a great title like that, at what point did you come up with the title, or was it suggested by someone else?
Actually, with Climbing the Stairs, it's my first novel, which is set in India in World War II. It looks at this whole very intense period in Indian history, and it looks at a young man who is part of my family who decided to be in the Second World War, in the armed forces in the Second World War. But although it is his story, it's seen through the eyes of my mother, who was a young girl at the time. And it's called Climbing the Stairs because in the house that she lived in, she was forced to live downstairs where the kitchen was, and only the men were allowed to climb up and go upstairs to where the library was in this old home. And it was a big deal that she would want to go up and get books out of the library. So, to me, Climbing the Stairs in that case immediately was a fantastic title because it was so literal, and it was also so rich in metaphor in so many ways, in terms of that whole nonviolence violence divide of this young person finding herself, of climbing from childhood into adolescence into adulthood. There are so many ways that it works as a metaphor of the country of India climbing from being an oppressed, subjugated colonial nation into freedom, and about that whole issue of moving from violence to nonviolence, etc., etc. It's a magnificent title, and it stayed. Island's End, another title that actually has an end of the island that you're talking about, the end of the island, where they can see from that place beyond into the tribe can see the modern people. So in that sense, it's actually it's a physical place, but it's also the end of the island in a sense because their way of life is threatened, and their society is endangered. So all of that, it has that sense of the island perhaps ending, and how that might happen. So it's metaphorical as well in that sense. A Time to Dance, again, that's a quote from the Christian scripture, from the Bible, and it's beautiful. That piece about it. Every there's a time for every season under heaven, and it's a quote that then works itself into the book. It is part of what one of the characters sees, and it made a perfect title for that book as well, and what it was about. When it came to the Bridge Home, I told you, I wrote it. I knew the voice was right, but I definitely did not have a title, and I could not think of a title, and it had a working title that my editor Nancy Paulson said. She said, this reads like a classic, but it reads like one of those classics that you look back and you think, what was the title again? Because it's such a forgettable title. And I've forgotten actually what it was. And
well, God bless the editor who has the has the forthrightness to say something that direct to you.
Oh, we've worked together for so long. I think we're quite honest with each other. So she came up with a list of titles. I brainstormed some titles, and then she was the one who finally came up with that combination. Excuse me. So hats off to her.
Well, Nancy, if you're watching or you're listening and you've always wanted to come on a podcast, I'd be thrilled to talk with you sometime. Please get in touch with me. While we're talking about just surface things about the novel, something else that I usually don't comment on, but I really love the cover for this novel, which of course I would. It's darkened characters against a bright background, which if anybody has paid attention to the covers I've helped had input in designing over the years, is something that very much resonates with me. How much input did you have on the cover?
I love the cover. And this was also the first cover that I just completely fell in love with from the beginning. I'd seen sketches, and there was a debate as there were 3 sketches and some question as to which sketch we would pick, but the differences were quite minor, frankly, and I loved this view. So the artist had drawn sort of the same bridge, but a couple of different views, and said, "What would you like?" I like this view a lot. It was also what my editor loved the most. So we went with that. I think my agent weighed in as well, Rob Weisbach, and we loved that cover. With the other covers, where I had more of a difficulty with, we went through several iterations of every other cover, but it seems like for this novel, everything just fell into place, except, of course, for that title, which, again, it fell into place as soon as Nancy chose it. But
Was the title come along after the cover?
No, the title came along before the cover.
Okay. I was like, what amazing foresight for the cover illustration. Put a bridge on there.
But what you talked about with the cover having, the title having this physical and this metaphorical resonance, I really wanted that, because I felt like all of my other titles had that. So every other title had a meaning that was physical, literal, and tangible, but also had a meaning that was metaphorical. And that was something that required, as I said, a little bit more work and a little more help with this one. But when it came, then I liked that a lot, because the word home could be the bridge to home. It could act as a verb as well as a noun, and I love that ambiguity.
Something else about the novel that I noted immediately is this could very easily be used in a school setting as a means to talk about the culture of India. There are several things throughout. We learn about some of the gods. I know Indira Gandhi comes up at one point. The caste system is referenced periodically. So I'm always curious, what is the balance? Because this doesn't read like a homework assignment where, okay, here I am, young reader, it's time to learn about India. It's just information that's scattered throughout with a great narrative to pull any reader through with these universal experiences. So what is is there a proper ratio for how much information to impart to make sure that you are teaching the reader about another culture versus telling that story? And when do you know where you're going too far one way or the other?
I think anytime you start to think that you're teaching, you have to stop. So I think only what is natural in the story. So everything that you speak about, the gods, the caste system, the setting, for instance, and everything else, all of that is what the characters experience. So none of that is explained. So the character will never, neither Ruku nor Vijay nor Muthu nor Arul will sit down and tell you, hey, look, this is what this is all about. And so I think that's the difference. I think you just have to, and it happens naturally. So the book is set in India, where I grew up. The story comes from India. It was born there. It's integrated with that culture and that setting. And so that milieu is then reflected in everything that the novel is about, and the story then references that, because that is sort of the ambience that is part of that story. It's kind of an integral part of that whole story. So I think if you start thinking you have to insert these bits in, then, or maybe, who knows, maybe other authors work differently, so I shouldn't speak for everyone. But for me, I think if I were to sit there and think, what is she eating? Is she eating something Indian? Oh, maybe not. Maybe I should put something Indian in. That feels forced. But of course,
they're largely eating bananas through most of the novel. We have those here.
Right. And so, that's, I guess, when that happens, or it just has to feel integral to the novel. It has to feel integrated with everything else. and not like information stuffed in. And I do think there's something to be said for knowing that your story, for believing, for trusting that your story will carry the reader through, even if at times they don't fully get a particular reference. If you were speaking about some kind of food, for instance, in the beginning, in the first scene in the novel, Viji walks in and she smells payasam, which her mother has been making. And we know that from what she says, we know it's sweet. We know it's syrupy. We know that there's a smell of milk. So we know there's milk in it. We know there's sugar in it. We don't need to have the recipe for payasam. We don't need to know how long she's been cooking it on the stove. And you know what I mean? We don't need to know all the different spices that go in. We have enough information. And for somebody who knows what that word is, who knows what payasam is, it makes complete sense. For someone else, they know enough that it makes enough sense for them to continue. And
that makes sense. You don't want to grind the story to a halt to simply discuss the food that's being eaten. There are more interesting things to come.
Right. You never want to halt your story and explain.
Oh gosh, so many questions about this book, and I'm watching the clock, and I know our time is moving right along faster than I'd like it to. I wanted to talk about Viji a little bit in that she's extremely practically minded, and she seems, in her ways, very devoid of sentimentality. She does not want to ever be seen as a beggar. She refuses charity. She's very much can do. She will find a way for her and for Ruku to get what they need and to take care of themselves. And the book, I don't know if it's as a consequence of that, seems to lack a bit of sentimentality. There are scenes just of endless, almost Dickensian is the word I'm looking for. Dickensian tragedy throughout, because we are dealing with orphans and extreme adverse situation. There are several scenes that if it were a lesser writer, maybe such as myself, would have gone through and made, okay, well, this needs its own separate chapter so we can really get the reader invested and hopefully make them cry. Author wanting to not engage with that, and how much that is simply because the narrator wouldn't want that.
It's both. It's both, I think. In this case, the narrator wouldn't want that, and she's not a sentimental person. And I also think we, as authors, have to keep sentiment out of it. I think I didn't ever want it to be mushy. I didn't ever want anything to feel like I wanted to make the reader cry. Now I'm delighted every time. It sounds horrible, but I am delighted every time somebody says that they cried, because then it means it touched them. And I also hope very much that everybody laughed, because there are parts of it that are funny to me. And I love it when I see a kid who is also laughing out loud in certain portions of the novel. And so I think I wanted both to be there. I wanted that humor and that sadness. But I think when sadness has to have a punch, it cannot be sentimental. To have, real power, you can't wade into that morass of maudlin sentimentalism. There has to be, I think sometimes, and it's a hard balance, and I have to be, less can be more. But ultimately, I think if you've set your characters up enough, if people are invested enough in the characters, then they will feel what the character feels. And you have to trust that. You can't want to take them there.
When do you know that you have it? When do you have the confidence that you've made your character sympathetic enough that you don't need to show us all of that sentimentality to know that you've touched the reader?
I don't know. I think it's partly intuition and partly intuition, partly experience, partly. I think if you read and read and read, and you were talking about me being a scientist, which I am, and loving mathematics, but I also, when in my spare time, I see some people who love mathematics enough that they'll do it in their spare time. They'll spend all their time doing puzzles or Sudoku or straights or whatever else it is. But I'm not one of those people. So in my spare time, I always read poetry and novels. And I think that's why I could write at the end of the day, because I love writing, and I read and I read and I read and I read. So every spare moment that I had, I mean, I did other things. I love to be outdoors and so on and so forth. But I also love to read. So I always was reading. All my life I've been reading. And I think that also gives you a sense that you may not even know, but it almost is your internal editor, or it's a guide, it's a compass that you sort of internalize that helps you when you're writing, to know when to push and when to pull back, to
That
know how
makes sense.
much to give.
So something that's kind of just earned as your from your love of books. Well, with the time that we have left, let's turn to just a few craft questions. Um, how much? What does your average day look like? How much of your time are you spending actually writing, and how often do you read? And what
I
do you read?
I read all over the place, and so I don't know. I read so much. I read now. I'm finally starting to even read newspapers from all over the world again, which I used to do a long time ago, and then I stopped. I used to read several newspapers every day in different languages too, and now I'm trying to start doing that again. So that will be nice. I enjoy doing that. I read I read a lot of novels. I also read a lot of poetry, which I love. I read old books. I read new books. I read books for adults. I read books for young people. I so there's no particular genre or anything, but I'm kind of moody. So if I go into a library, which I go into a library or a bookstore, then I pick whatever strikes my fancy. And I always have a huge to be read pile that's sometimes based on what people have said. Sometimes it's people that I know who've written a book or something. So I read nonfiction too, so that's important because many people don't read nonfiction. I read a lot of nonfiction as well, literary nonfiction I like. And so I have all of that going. And that was your second question. And your first question was about my day. And for a very long time, when I had stepped back from my oceanography career, and I still am, in another sense, a full-time mother, or the parent at home who is the one that does most of the child responsibilities. And so because of that sort of childcare component, I can never be sure if a day is going to be, for instance, a snow day here in Rhode Island. Sometimes we have snow even in April. And so then,
Fortunately, we have that here in Indiana as well.
right. And so then I would be the one who would stay home. So I can never be certain. But when I do have time, those precious hours that now I have when everybody is away from the house, those are the hours that I then work and I write. So I try very hard to write and keep that sacrosanct. I didn't have that for a long time. So when I was sort of staying home with my child, with my daughter, then I ended up not having those times at all. So we would do so much together that it would give me very little time to write. When that happened, I would stay in touch with my characters mentally. So I would always connect with them. And I think the best advice I have for people who have very little time is to stay in your book and to let the book stay in you. Just in your heart and in your head as much as you can, even if you can't get it down on paper. I always have a notebook next to my bed, so I sometimes write before I go to sleep or when I wake up early in the morning. So those are times that I might just scribble down thoughts or something. I take a book with me wherever I go. If it's on holiday somewhere, I still have a book with me that I can scribble in. So that's something that's important. And
Do
I
you do most of your drafting by hand, or do you type?
No, now I type. I mean, and even with my first book, I started typing, and I do type on the computer, and my books are on the computer, so I have that with me as well whenever I go. But I'm not a person who can as yet I can't write notes on the cell phone. That just doesn't work for me. So that's what my notebook is for. But I think staying in touch with your characters as much as you can, and my books take a long time, but that's okay because at the end of the day, I think family comes first, and if I didn't do these other things, then I would miss out on portions of my child's life, which I don't want to do.
No, there isn't a book worth missing out on that.
No.
What, well, one more question on reading, and then I'm going to ask you about flying saucers because I know esteemed audience desperately wants to know. But about reading, you've spoken elsewhere about racism's problematic predominance in classic literature and a lot of other isms as well. I know that classics like The Secret Garden, are classics for a reason, but they've got problematic elements in there. One of my very favorite author when I was the age for middle grade books was Roald Dahl, and I did a podcast not long ago on Dream Gardens podcast with Jody Leamont, and I picked The Witches, which is my all-time favorite middle grade book growing up. And I was getting prepared. I'm like, I haven't read this in a few years. I better read it again. And I was reading other articles about it, talking about how sexist it was. I was like, no, not my beloved Roald Dahl. And then I read it again. I was like, oh no, that's pretty sexist right there. So what is the proper way to deal with these classics of literature for young readers? Because we don't want to forget where we've been, where we've come from. But how do we discuss these books as classics without also discussing but by definition, the progress that's come since then?
I think you need to discuss that. I think, I wrote a blog post for the Nerdy Book Club that I encourage everyone who's listening to this podcast to just Google Nerdy Book Club and my name, Padma Venkatraman, and classics, colonialism, and a call for change. I think that was the name of the blog post that I wrote. And I think that's an important blog post that I did. It doesn't say anything about my own work, but I think it says a lot that needs to be heard. But I do think that some things that we can do when children have books like that are to make sure that we discuss them, to discuss these elements in them after the child finishes reading the book. And it's easy with certain children. It may not be easy with other children, but somehow, somewhere, you need to actually have that conversation about that book. Because otherwise, if it's a child like my own child, then maybe they will look and understand the racism because they have experienced it. But if it's a child who has never experienced racism, then what they're imbibing is that it's fine to be like that. It's okay to have this protagonist, this hero who is racist. And that's not a great message to give to a child. And I think that's what we're doing. Or these other subtle isms that are in these books are also then being imbibed and being inculcated in a way. Maybe not inculcated is too much, maybe just imbibed, and then become potentially seeds of insidious prejudice that we may not even be aware of. And so I think we need to just be careful of that, to have conversations that are open about the topic in general, about the book in particular, if that's possible. And of course, that always is a problem that one faces when one has a reader that is a voracious reader, which is a fantastic problem to have, is that the child then starts to read so much that you can't possibly keep up with the child. But then you may need to have conversations about these topics very openly and say these things show up in many of these books. And for instance, I've read that blah, 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 in which it shows up. Has it shown up in any of your books or whatever else? So that we have that give and take. You have that discussion. You at least open it and allow. In that particular case, it's not through a book. So I think it's fine to educate and to have that conversation and that discussion with a child. In fact, it's very important. It's vital. I don't think you should go on without that discussion. I do think it's imperative to have that discussion be part of what's going on. With some of these classics, I do wonder if we need them. I also think there are ways to pair books. So if you have The Catcher in the Rye, for instance, which is about a young white man who comes from a very wealthy background, doing things that only he can do, because nobody of color would be allowed to do that in this country, and nobody who is a first-generation immigrant would dare to do anything like he does, because we would be on the next boat back home if we tried. And so there's sort of a level of privilege that book reflects that needs to then be examined, that needs to be discussed, and then maybe there's a way to pair it with another book. If you're going to read Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, for instance, which is written in very lyrical language, but reduces the entire continent of Africa to one sort of blotchy, smudged, blurred backdrop to a white man's descent into insanity, then I think you need to read Chinua Achebe to balance that. Things fall apart. Or somebody else. There are so many other brilliant African authors. Nnedi Okorafor. There are others as well that that I can think of and that I don't necessarily want to all list, but there's so many other people that you can think of and read. And so I think if you're going to read that, or if you're going to read about India as seen through this prejudiced white woman's eyes, then you need to read an Own Voices book. If you're going to read The Secret Garden, which was written by this person who had a colonial idea of things, then read The Bridge Home. Read a book that does that. And I do think with these classics, you don't need to buy the classics. Borrow classics from the library, buy the books of living authors. And I mean, I say that now, and it might sound like a joke, but it is so true, because more and more we're starting to see human beings who don't understand that if you are going to appreciate and enjoy or experience essentially something that is given to you by somebody who has created something, by somebody who's creative, then you need to support that person's creativity, not take it for granted, and I think that's something that's important as well. I think, supporting independent bookstores, supporting people is important. So I think classics, there are plenty of them in the library. Read them. I have no problem with you downloading a classic free of charge. I have no problem with you doing any of that, because I think I love that you compared my work to Dickens, and the Bridge Home has been called actually Oliver Twist meets Slumdog Millionaire, which I thought was a very kind of an apt description, a catchy description of the book. But if Dickens's grandchild doesn't get a cut of his royalties, I couldn't care less.
No, here, I agree with you. Buy our books. So, I 100% endorse that.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, the books of living authors, and then go to the library to read the dead ones. We need to keep our libraries up. I think libraries are so important. This is National Library Week, and I think we have to support that as well. And I think that's something else that you can do. And then, ultimately, you are the one that makes the classics of tomorrow. You make those choices. Do you think these classics have enough in them that they need to be read and read? I mean, I'm not talking about all of them. I'm talking about all of them now at one shot. And there are obviously exceptions, and my exceptions will not be your exceptions, et cetera, et cetera. But can we make a concerted effort to question whether these classics need to be classics, whether we really love them enough to pass them on, or whether there are maybe new books that are equally as interesting that we then read? So invest time in reading new books that are out there, especially for children, because maybe you can put a book that isn't a classic into a child's hands, and it will do exactly what that classic did for you. So look at what's coming out now, what has been around for a while, and maybe put those books into children's hands. I mean, Mildred Taylor's Roll of Thunder, Hear Me Cry. Why don't we have that more often? Why, yes, fine, Huck Finn again being one idea, one view only, and somebody else is completely silenced, then give respect to that silenced voice by having at least a few other authors from that silenced community. Because let's not also just have one author from a particular community and pretend that we're being diverse because there's just one African-American author in this world today? No, there are so many. And I think that's important as well. So when we respect diversity, we need to respect diversity in all those forms. And until now, in large part, the classics have all been written by white people. So I think if we're going to have that many voices, we're seeing the diversity in that Eurocentric view. Let's also see the diversity in every non-Eurocentric view as well, in every sub-community that we can think of, in every culture that we can think of. Let's be truly multicultural, let's be truly diverse, and let's examine that as well. And again, I do think there are so many brilliant books that have been written since the classics. that we can create new classics to go with some of the old ones as well.
I'm thinking one more question on the back of that, and then I've got two more questions for you, and we'll call it a podcast. But with the hope, I always joke that the moment I'm dead, all of my books will become beloved across all cultures. They're all going to be made into films and celebrated forever. And if that's not true, I probably won't know about it. It's fine. But how do we, since future generations by definition will be more progressive than we are at this point, I say optimistically, because I hope that they'll know more, they'll be smarter. What's the best way to ensure that we're writing books that might have a better shot at standing the test of time so we won't be on the problem list?
I think you can only write from your heart. And I think the best way to write a book is to write the best book you can. You know, we've spoken about writing the best book you possibly can for the characters. I feel sort of a responsibility to the characters in my head to write the best book I can for them. And beyond that, I can't think. When I start to think, and I think it's easy to spoil your own writing and just to sort of, to not draw from the right place if you start thinking too much about how your book may or may not do. So we have this term which comes up actually in A Time to Dance. It's called karma yoga. That means you do your best and you put every fiber of your being, you put every bit of your blood and your sweat into your work. You pour your emotion into it. You pour your intelligence into it. You pour your time and your energy into it. And then you let go. And you may guide that. But I'm certainly not saying you let go to the point that, you don't help your novel out as much as you can once it's there. But you have to not be worried too much. You have to find a place, and it's so hard to do, and I don't do it all the time, and I don't do it well all the time, is to not worry about or not to be affected by how it does or doesn't do in the world. To not allow the material success, the material rewards, or lack thereof to affect you as a writer. And to keep on putting, your best foot forward, to keep on writing the best you can write and not worry about how it may or may not do in the future and even in today's marketplace. And it's easy to say that, and it's very hard to do. But I think that's all you can do as a writer, is to write the very best book you can and then hope for it. Pray for it, hope for it.
I think that's a good play, as good a spot as we could hope to end. But I wouldn't be doing my job, and I wouldn't be the middle grade ninja if I didn't ask. Dr. Padma Venkatraman, have you ever seen a flying saucer, and do you believe in them?
No, I haven't ever seen a flying saucer. I would love to. I'd love to think that we're not alone out there in the universe and that there are other nice human or not so human beings somewhere. I would love that. I'd love to think of how large the universe is and time and space and think there's somebody else out there. That said, I know that the project in Arizona, those big telescopes that show up in the movie Contact in the book.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that was a project that was out there to try to find intelligent life, SETI, and nothing's happened yet. So as a scientist, I think the chances are pretty slim, but as an author, I love that idea.
I think that's as fair an answer as we can hope for. Padma, where can esteemed audience find more about you online? Where can they stalk you and find all your books?
My website is a good place to start, www.padmavenkatraman.com, and Venkatraman, and people often spell that wrong. And Padma, of course, my first name is just Padma. So my website is a place that has information. You can't buy my books through that, but my books are available anywhere. Penguin Random House is my publisher, has always been my publisher, is the person who published all of my novels. So yeah, if you put my titles in and my name in, you could find that. And I am on Twitter. And on Twitter, my handle is at Padma, Padma TV, like television, and that's because T and V are my initials of my middle name and my last name, but I didn't even think of it, so I don't have a television at home, but at Padma TV is my Twitter handle, and Venkatraman.Padma is how you'll find me on Facebook or Instagram, so those are other ways to connect with me. I'm learning to navigate Instagram. I'm not there all the time, and I don't know too much about that, but I'm there. And I think I have a YouTube channel too, which may get used more frequently because the Bridge Home is a global read aloud. So I'm very excited about that. It's the middle grade read aloud for this year. So it'll be read by schools around the world, which makes me very, very honored.
Well, that's very exciting.
Yep.
Well, of course, I'm available at middlegradeninja.com. Follow me on Twitter at mgninja. Make sure you download your free ebook copy of Banneker Bones and the Giant Robot Bees. Don't forget to come back on Thursday because we're going to have literary agent Holly Root here. Papa, this has been a wonderful conversation. I can't thank you enough for making the time to do this. I have learned so much about writing. I re-listen to all these shows. That's the gift they give back to me, is I get to come back in here and really analyze this advice. And I know this is one I'm going to listen to at least 6 or 7 times, fast forward through the parts where I'm talking and relearn all the things you said. Been asking our guests to sign us off. Our sign-off phrase is hiya and what have you. When you sign us off,
Hiya and what have you.